So again, my name is Broc Anderson. I'm a man of many hats. I am also an adjunct professor at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. But there's 3 words I want to add to your vocabulary when it comes to defining history. And these words were used, besides one out here. So the first, being perspective. Perspective of who's telling that history. Oftentimes we think about the victors being the ones that tell that story, more often than not. We talk about interpretation, because in doing history, we think about using our present mindness and trying to understand the past. We may never fully understand the past because we have a leg up on those folks that are back in the 1850s, 1860s. But we can use some of these primary source materials to better understand these different perspectives and these ideas that we can bring out through our interpretation of the past. And then the third one is questions. You have to learn how to ask questions. Because from there, once you get all this information, you get these dates, you get these people's names, you get all these different events. But if you're just taking it for the year, the dates, the names, you're not getting some of this other secondary meaning behind this historical event. So, as you're thinking about the Oregon Trail and the Pony Express and all these different places that come through Nebraska, and so for my research and for a lot of the information that I'm going to present to you today, there's an emphasis on one specific event and place. So specifically around this last period of time in the late 19th century called the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, it's kind of the marquee point where the Indian Wars are then over. And then we're progressing into this new era of U.S.-Indian relations into the 20th century. But the other dynamic that I present here today is this place, Northwest Nebraska. Specifically with Wounded Knee, we have this place that is largely what we would consider in South Dakota or on Pine Ridge Reservation, but very few scholars or people interested in Wounded Knee history very rarely looked further south as to the people that were involved, the places that became a hub for trading, and these economic and social interactions that had taken place. And doing so, by looking at this place and in this specific event, we're making this one point in time, in this one place, the end game for our research. So we're looking back, however far it may be. So for in this case, we're looking back to the 1860s, to things that had an important role in playing into what had happened at the Wounded Knee massacre site, using social economic interactions between the U.S. military, immigrants, and the Lakota. And so, for the statement of purpose in this presentation, in analyzing native and non-native relations between 1884 and 1904, historians may better understand how Nebraska had an impact on events leading up to and during and following the Wounded Knee Massacre on December 29th, 1890. We're going to definitely follow up, be more specifically about the before today. It's also, again, if you have this great body of research, you're talking about this history, you got to explain why it matters. Why does it matter to people today in the 21st century? And so it is my hope that through this research that both sides and stories are told here so that the Lakotas and the Northwest Nebraskans may understand that their histories are deeply intertwined with each other in the 21st century. So again, history is about perspective, interpretation, and questions. All facilitates this idea of why does it matter. As far as resources and methods, I don't necessarily want to advocate writing a master's thesis during a global pandemic when all these archival institutions are closed and you have to rely on a lot of these online resources or resources that you can access. So my thesis took about 2 years, and I was able to get in to all the institutions that I wanted to eventually, but it took some time, and it took some creative thinking. Do we have any folks from the Sand Hills area? Gordon, Rushville, Hay Springs? Yeah, or even Alliance. So they have this great body of local histories written by the families themselves. And granted, you have to take some of this with a grain of salt, because again, it's their perspectives, their interpretation, some of their questions that they had, and you have to apply this to other information that you are acquiring as you go along the way. And so prior to non-native settlement, this is going to be what a lot of Lakota are going to claim to be this land, this 1851 treaty land that is their territory. And you can see greatly over time into the 21st century where those reservations look like now. So you see the present day. See if I can, nope, not gonna show up on the laser pointer there. But Pine Ridge Reservation, just north of the Nebraska border. We also have Rosebud Reservation, just north of the Nebraska border. But the Lakota, Oglala, Sikanju, a variety of different native peoples are going to call and have this shared space their home. Granted, they have other people that they have to contend for with this land, such as the Pawnee, the Cheyenne, whoever it may be. And to give you a background on some of what was going on at Wounded Knee. So Wounded Knee happened December 29th, 1890, and it was at what many historians then in the US military coined as the height or the last fight of the Indian Wars that were taking place. And so Wounded Knee, the massacre, it was originally known as a battle. And being the battle that it was permeated throughout the country and the press, through the local accounts in northwest Nebraska, when people are hiding in their various courthouses, churches, and congregating in these little communities. But the dynamics of this include ghost dancing, lack of resources or lack of food, some hard summers that were going on at that time. And so specifically with Wounded Knee, we have Bigfoot's band that is fleeing to Red Cloud's people on Pine Ridge, and Bigfoot's intercepted by the 7th Cavalry. 7th Cavalry, where have we heard them before? Custer Massacre, right? Custer Battle. And so with some of the motivations, per some military local accounts, we see about the number of people that are massacred of Bigfoot's band ranges anywhere from 200 to 400 people. Really the catalyst in getting the US military involved in Pine Ridge Agency, Northwest Nebraska, was this idea that ghost dancing is this rebellious dancing that is defying what the US has been trying to do over the last 10, 15 years in trying to get the Lakota to accept this acculturation, this US idea of farming, taking up the land, and these Jeffersonian ideas overall. And so it was this idea that ghost dancing was this outright rejection. And it started by Wavaka in Nevada and spreads throughout the Great Plains. All comes to head at Wounded Knee River, Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. And so if you get up to the current Wounded Knee Massacre site, you see we've got Sitting Bull on the left. He was murdered just days before Bigfoot heads out further south and west. They dig this long trench that's still at the massacre site today. It's on the top of the hill. They built a memorial for it in the 19 teens. And they talk about the massacre site from the Lakota perspective. Because, again, prior to the 1960s, 1950s, it was often referred to as the Wounded Knee Battle. So that's just a little bit of background. That's like your 10-cent version of kind of some of the things, the dynamics happening at Wounded Knee. And so you look at who's to blame. So according to a lot of historians today, it is the people in Washington, D.C. that are mostly to blame for the buildup of troops in Nebraska and Pine Ridge by November of 1890. There's also the blame that perhaps this was the 7th Cavalry that was involved. They wanted to avenge the death of Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn. But we also have this other dynamic that isn't so widely discussed, but has a far more reaching and indirect impact. That includes these non-native settlers, these immigrants that are coming further west, that dispossess and deteriorate native Lakota life. And so one of probably the most prominent authors out here in western Nebraska, her name is Mari Sandoz, and she had a very well-known book called Old Jewels. She describes how hard it was to live and settle in this place called Rushville or Gordon and these sand hills of northwest Nebraska. But her second book, and probably her book that has the far most reaching impact, is Crazy Horse, The Strange Man of the Ogalallas. She describes in interviews all of these people that had something to do with Crazy Horse, to fully understand who that man was, this famed warrior that was killed out at Fort Robinson. And so how she starts her book, quite literally the first chapter, Cow Tracks on the Holy Road being the Oregon Trail. So the trail started with just a little stream of white men coming through. And the Indian lifted his hand in welcome and went out to smoke and watch this lengthening village of the whites. So from a Lakota's perspective, through Mari Sandoz, it started as this small stream of white people coming through. They're not settling, they're coming through. But soon, that little stream of whites grew into a river, wider than a gun could shoot across, and the grass and the buffalo got so used up that the Indian ponies were far into Sundance time, and the hunters had to travel many days, sometimes clear to the Crow country for a kettle of fresh meat. So we talk about, gosh, how many people are we seeing along the Oregon Trail? Thousands and thousands. That doesn't include people on the Mormon Trail, the California Trail. I mean, it's the same kind of trail. But the fact that they're still coming through this region, utilizing these resources, impacts these native peoples that are residing in this area. So people like Red Cloud, Spotted Tail, this is Dull Knife or Morning Star. And then we've got Young Man Afraid of His Horses. They all see this as a major problem. And so initially, what they wanted to do is they wanted to facilitate, help these people get through their area, not settle on the land. But seeing how much devastation that they had on the way, being so much cholera along the Platte and North Platte River, using up all the bison, hunting all this game, they wanted to charge these Oregon Trail travelers. Again, I know our previous presenter talked about how the Oregon Trail game was a map. Surprisingly, too, they got it pretty well right at that time. Because if you played the Oregon Trail game, how many of us were attacked by Indians in that game? Maybe a handful of you, because it didn't really happen all that often. So there was a clear, distinct boundary between this thing that was called the Holy Road and these native peoples that were there in that region originally, because of this U.S. military involvement that's going to come and take place. Okay? But these forts are also jumping off points to other places, such as Montana. What do we got going on in Montana? Gold rush, right? And so there was this contracted agreement between the Lakota, I want to say not even a whole handful of Lakota. I mean, it included Red Cloud, several Makanju, Sikanju, Cheyenne, but with the dynamic of native peoples at that time, the Seven Council Fires, there were a lot of folks that were left out of those discussions. And so this boundary that was created halfway through the state of Wyoming, north of the North Platte River, was set to be native territory until gold was found. Gold was found in Montana. And so our previous presenter talked about how being first on the scene or being the first to do something was incredibly important, hence why we get what's called the Bozeman Trail. Goes right through Powder River country and directly conflicts with the agreements between the United States and the native peoples that called that area home. And so we have John Jacobs and several others that are going up into Montana, and they get to the Powder River and they're met with some resistance. And they are told, you are to not cross this river, you are to go back to Fort Laramie, or else a major fight will ensue. As we know, that fight is going to ensue into Red Cloud's War. And so a lot of these early encounters between native peoples and immigrants and the U.S. military are shrouded in violence, conflict. It's not so much the social or economic interaction that takes place very early on. Granted, when it was first starting out, things were okay until those resources started getting used up and people were competing for them. And so, again, the U.S. military can't necessarily put its foot down completely on these various Lakota people because they've got the knowledge of the land, they have this large cluster of other people and tribes and nations that they can utilize to keep engaging with the U.S. military as they're trying to build Fort Kearny out in Wyoming, to build all these other places that they see, or as Red Cloud sees, as in direct violation to some of these treaties that were created. Instead of continuing war, there were some concessions made. So, further out in Wyoming, just to the west of us, Red Cloud, Spotted Tail would have been in South Dakota, but Red Cloud had made some concessions about relocating his people into northwest Nebraska, where present-day Fort Robinson is today. It was called Red Cloud Agency. And these agencies were these administrative centers that were run by appointed officials from Washington, D.C., that administered reparations. They administered treaty obligations such as rations, foodstuffs, wagons, farming equipment, and then dispersed to a chief or a key leader that then dispersed to other people. And when a location was chosen, they wanted to pick as far northwest of Nebraska as possible. Because again, what do we got going on further south? The Holy Road, right? We have the possibility of a transcontinental railroad. We got the Oregon Trail. This is a clearly defined path from the East Coast to the West Coast. And we can't have these hostile people attacking it whenever treaty negotiations fall through. So these people are purposely put up in the area of the Pine Ridge or the Chadron area or Crawford area, what is going to become the future of Dawes and Sheridan counties. In the meantime, we have Red Cloud Agency. Spotted Tail Agency is eventually going to be relocated just to the northeast of Red Cloud Agency in relatively close proximity. But because of their history, because of the warring history between the U.S. military and the Lakotas, and the relationship they had started to form with these immigrants and these people that were passing through, sending on like, oh my gosh, these Indians are wild. They're hunting us down. They're killing people out here. They established 2 forts or camps, military outposts. So Fort Robinson or Camp Robinson when it was first established, and Camp Sheridan. They were considered posts in unison with Fort Laramie, specifically to enforce the rule of law at both Red Cloud Agency and Spotted Tail Agency. If something were to go wrong, they would be there to not only enforce the relationship between Native peoples and the administration of the United States government, but also to keep at bay some of these immigrants that were coming through the area or that were going to come through the area. With the U.S. military being the protector of these immigrants coming out, it's setting this military precedence in handling Native and non-Native relations, usually in favor of the U.S. government. So again, Camp Robinson, Camp Sheridan are established. Camp Robinson, there's a great early picture of the Robinson, of the Pine Ridge area where Crawford, Nebraska is. Red Cloud Agency is further east into the Pine Ridge Agency. And then, of course, Camp Sheridan. You can go to Fort Robinson today, but you can't go to Camp Sheridan. Similarly to the Bozeman Trail, to these folks that were traveling north to go to take on the opportunities of gold and merchants trying to sell to these miners, same script. Black Hills, there's opportunities for these immigrants coming out this way, these non-native travelers that are going to impede onto these native territories, thus causing problems, thus competing for the same resources. We've heard of the Gordon Party. They had the Gordon Stockade up in the north towards the Black Hills. And some of these other trails that are coming in from the northern part of the Panhandle, they're purposely trying to evade the forts that are up in the eastern part of South Dakota, and then the forts that are further west, like Camp Robinson's and Camp Sheridan, Fort Laramie. They don't want to necessarily always come from the Holy Road and then straight north and follow some of those treaty obligations. No. Again, just like with our Bozeman Trail, the first one to the scene has a lot more opportunity than the 150th or the 3,000th person. So, what a lot of these folks are going to do, they're going to travel along this very northern and desolate part of Nebraska. Again, not a lot of people living out this way. In the 1860s, 1870s, 1874, Black Hills gold was discovered by Custer. And so we see this stream of people, this stream of immigrants that are traveling just south of the present-day South Dakota border along the northern side of northwest Nebraska. And just before they get to Camp Sheridan, they're going to head north through Indian country to evade U.S. military officials and other agency administrators. One of those people that get caught is John Gordon himself. He has this trading center. It's called Gordon City, and it was located on the Antelope Creek. So if we've ever been to Gordon, Nebraska, it's going to be just further south and east of the community along the Antelope Creek. And so it was established on this peninsula of the Niobrara River, where they were using the Niobrara River as a way to transport goods and gold further east. And if they ever came under attack, well, they had that taken care of as well, because all they had to do was ford the river and then quickly make their escape after that big old flush of water comes through and sends them on their way further east. Problem with that, though, U.S. military, U.S. government, they're catching a lot of heat for this. That the folks in the east, there were a small number of people saying like, this isn't quite right. We're not upholding some of our obligations to these people that we had discussed per the 1851, 1868 Fort Laramie treaties. So we see a very young couple generals that are purposely lying and trying to manipulate the situation to seem that it was not as bad as what it was. And that these people, they're catching people, they're trying to turn them away, and they're having a lot more success than they really were. And they use the Gordon Party as an example. So one night, they found, they had heard wind of the Gordon Party in this Gordon City, just to the east of Spotted Tail Agency. And they had heard this through Spotted Tail himself, one of his sons. He had said that, if you don't go take care of this problem, I will take care of it myself. Ultimately, in a layman's terms, short terms. And so that prompts the U.S. military to get involved. And so from military regiments from Camp Robinson and Camp Sheridan, they go out to this place called Gordon City. They set the whole community ablaze, all of their wagons, and people are massacred at that time. And so Gordon City is used as this example to show that the U.S. military was doing its best to try to keep people at bay from going onto this Indian territory. But in all reality, Mr. Gordon actually gets money from the U.S. federal government to pay for the damages that were incurred on this raid. So again, a lot of violence, a lot of conflict that derives from these folks that are traveling from one place to the other or impeding on some of this native territory. Not so much settlement yet, not permanent settlement, but following the 1878, 1879 relocation of Red Cloud and Spotted Tail up to Pine Ridge and Rosebud reservations, we begin to see this open land that's open for settlement and new opportunities to provide these folks with rations, beef issues, trade, commerce of any kind. So we see this non-native settlement that's not necessarily going to the Black Hills, finding gold, but trying to take up the land. Some of those first people were involved with what was called the Newman Ranch. The Newman Ranch, very, very large ranch. It had upwards of 60, 80,000 cattle on their ranch at one point. Jim Dahlman, have we heard that name before? Jim Dahlman, he's one of those cowboys that are going to be involved with the Spade Ranch and also become the sheriff over in Dawes County. So these first people, they're defining what this opportunity is going to look like between these non-native settlers and native settlers. It's going to be defined by these ranchers that are selling these beef issues to the reservation, and they're going to be really looking north in terms of trying to make a profit, trying to live off the land. We also have another gentleman by the name of Reverend Skemahorn, who is bringing people out here for religious purposes. And so what Reverend Skemahorn does, he sees, again, this opportunity, this open land, being the first out here to settle and bring 200-300 people out with him, and forming this community not necessarily with the reservation in mind, but having this community where he has and is the main leader for it as a religious and well-trained and well-rounded individual. And so these other towns, such as Gordon, Rushville, Hay Springs, Chadron, and many more, they're being established on these various trails that are further northwest in Nebraska, and eventually with the Chicago Northwestern Railroad, because the railroad is what brings and establishes these communities largely, that these communities then become far more populated. And they realize the opportunity with these railroads that they can ship these markets, have these connections, that the U.S. government is interested in trying to maintain its treaty obligations, provide these rations, provide all these other aspects that Northwest Nebraska can serve as in its capacities. So again, these folks, they are issued beef rations. A lot of these beef rations are coming from ranchers and farmers and people just south of the border, not only in Nebraska, but Wyoming, parts of South Dakota. But some of this social element is still there. You're not going to just walk up to someone and say, trade, money. No, that's not human nature. You're going to interact with them one way or another. You're going to go, hey, how's it going? My name is, your name is. And as those interactions take place more frequently, you're going to find there's going to be other opportunities or other ways that your cultures can at least align or meet somewhere. So you see a lot of these native peoples or Sioux Indians or Lakota people that are going to come down into northwest Nebraska. They're going to be in full-on regalia. They're going to have their headdress. They're going to have these outfits that they're going to use to perform, not only in Gordon, Rushville, Hay Springs, and Chadron, but places all over the world. So the Buffalo Bill Wild West shows. Buffalo Bill comes to Chadron, to Rushville, to Gordon in northwest Nebraska to get many of his first native actors to start off with. One of which being Red Shirt, Chief Red Shirt, or Sitting Bull. He needed some of these key figures that were on the Great Plains to rally these native actors that were so much so the subject of news media in the 1860s and the 1870s, that there would be an interest in having these folks come down and travel along with the Wild West shows for Buffalo Bill, but also the Miller 101 shows, the Kickapoo Medicine Company. It's not just Buffalo Bill. There's a whole slew of these companies that are coming up to this region and taking advantage of these native actors and their culture and trying to get them to use them as a profit. Oftentimes we talk about how these shows, especially with Buffalo Bill seems to be about the anomaly for a lot of these shows. Buffalo Bill allowed a lot of these Lakota men and women to express and continue to practice their culture. So in many ways, Buffalo Bill helped Lakota people. But for the Miller 101 shows and Kickapoo Medicine Company shows that they do all across the United States, it wasn't good. In fact, oftentimes you would see native actors, either when they're done or they don't want it to perform anymore or they were too exhausted, they were simply abandoned. Even despite the fact their contractual agreement said that they had to be returned one way or another to the reservation. So we have this whole other social element that's taking place between immigrants, non-native settlers, and the Lakota, where the Indians were utilized for shows, for their fascination from these encounters with the U.S. military. So within these shows, the Lakota actors themselves, they're not only depicting Native American way of life, but also the battles that ensue. One of those battles that become really, really popular for Buffalo Bill and a lot of his Wild West shows being the Battle of Wounded Knee at Wounded Knee Creek in December 29th of 1890. So we're talking again, these non-native settlers, they're coming to Northwest Nebraska, and they are providing a resource to these folks, to the Lakota, just the north of the border. But it's not necessarily just okay, so here's this cow, you get this cow, it's a nice, big, hefty cow, it should serve your family really well. Oftentimes, the cattle, if there was a hard summer, the cattle that would go further north were the worst ones of the bunch. And even then, we had alcohol abuse. We have alcohol going north. We have all these other ammunitions, guns, weapons that are prohibited on the reservation per the U.S. military. And so the U.S. military and these administrative agencies like Pine Ridge Agency, they're trying to limit this. So the U.S. military initially was this proponent for all these immigrants that are coming out this way, protecting them one way or another, now is trying to, again, coming under fire for a lot of the maltreatment, some of the malnourishment, and the resentment that's building up on Pine Ridge Agency among Red Cloud and many others to deter some of these Wild West shows and some of this illegal trading that was taking place in the mid-1880s to absolutely as minimal as possible in 1889, 1890. Because at that point, we have what's called the Indian scares. So we have these folks, we have the Carsons, we have, specifically with the Carsons themselves, they have this sod house. It's strategically put up in a way that is going to have a vantage point to see the north, the west, and the east, so that way they couldn't be snuck up on from Pine Ridge. And whenever there was a threat of any kind or any news of any kind, whether it be true or untrue, they would all meet at what was called Camp Carson, or simply the sod house that the neighbors would all congregate to. They'd sleep in shifts. They would have these places and these rides into town, into Hay Springs or Rushville, to see what news that they could get. And these Indian scares, they went on from the summer of 1890 through December and even part of January, February of 1891. The fact that this social, this economic transaction that was taking place wasn't going so well for certain people just north of the border. And even then, this Indian scare that's taking place, they have volunteer regiments from veterans that had served in the area prior to, that knew the Indian, formalize these loose militias to protect families and communities. One of those stories involves Zinkala Nuni, or Lasberg. So from the Wounded Knee battle site, or Wounded Knee massacre site, we have this infant child that is found in her deceased mother's arms. And so from there, we have General Colby, who is going to pick up that child, adopt the child, and use this baby, this infant, as an example to use this infant as a way to show acculturation, to show that these native peoples are able to practice Western culture. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm getting through this as fast as I can. But Lieutenant Colby, he talks about in this letter here exactly why he's going about and adopting this child, him and his wife, and what they were going to do to use this child as a way to propel and propose that the Lakota people could be peaceful, that they could acquire these farming skills and be of a Western cultured mind. So folks, again, to kind of wrap all of this up and what we had talked about at the very beginning, history is perspective. The perspective presented here today is the fact that, Northwest Nebraska, these various trails and these immigrants that are coming through this area had largely defined this U.S.-Indian relationship throughout the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. And then as far as the interpretation that's presented here, I'm trying to pull from both as much as we can. So we have perspectives on the Skimhorn, the Newman Ranch. They're here to take advantage of the opportunity, being the first ones out here. This is the United States, but again, at the same time, we have these indigenous folks that are given the very, very bare minimum and have these various illegal trades that are going on and taken advantage of for some of their cultural aspects. And then the questions. The questions, well, I'll leave to you. So, thank you.